In a world where justice often battles against manipulation and deceit, the story of one man's rise to infamy stands as a chilling testament to how easily systems can be fooled. This is the story of Kimball, a man whose violent actions were masked by a facade of cooperation with the FBI, leading to a series of tragic murders and the destruction of countless lives. Kimball's story begins not with violence, but with calculated manipulation. At first glance, he seemed like any other individual living a quiet, ordinary life. He blended in seamlessly with society, presenting an image of a well-adjusted, respectable individual. However, beneath this calm exterior, a much darker reality existed. Kimball's violent tendencies were not born overnight, they were the product of years of careful cultivation. His need for control over others and a thirst for power drove him to carefully construct a facade of trustworthiness, which would serve him well in his future criminal endeavors. Kimball's upbringing may have played a role in shaping the man he would become, though it is unclear whether early childhood trauma or a predisposition for power was the true cause of his violent nature. Whatever the origin of his character, the result was the same. Kimball sought to dominate those around him, carefully selecting victims who were either vulnerable or trusting enough to be easily manipulated. He quickly learned how to use his charm and understanding of human psychology to get what he wanted, often luring people into positions where he could exert control over them, both physically and emotionally. The first victims in Kimball's deadly spree were Leanne Emery, Jennifer Markham, and Casey McLeod. Each murder followed a disturbing and methodical pattern, one that would repeat as Kimball's thirst for dominance grew. It became clear that he was not acting out of rage or momentary impulse, but out of a deeply ingrained desire to manipulate and ultimately eliminate those who stood in his way or no longer served a purpose in his warped worldview. Leanne Emery's death was the first significant sign that Kimball was not an ordinary criminal. Initially, Kimball had been a trusted acquaintance to Emery. She had no reason to suspect that the person she was dealing with could be capable of such heinous actions. In fact, she trusted him enough that her death was the result of an intimate betrayal. Kimball used his personal connection with her to lure her into a situation where he could eliminate her without hesitation. It was not a crime of passion, driven by anger or fear, but one of calculated coldness. This first murder set the stage for what would become a chilling and consistent pattern in Kimball's criminal behavior. Emery was no mere victim of a violent outburst. She was a target of Kimball's intricate manipulation, selected because of her perceived trustworthiness and vulnerability. There was no sense of urgency or chaos in the way she died. It was an orchestrated event that Kimball had planned with chilling precision. In the same way that one might strategically place pieces on a chessboard, Kimball moved his victim into position and executed his plan without mercy. Once Leanne Emery was gone, Jennifer Markham followed. Like Emery, Markham had a personal connection to Kimball. She, too, trusted him enough to open up about her life, allowing him to gather intimate details that he would later use against her. The relationship was built on a lie, and Kimball's manipulative tendencies grew more apparent as he sought out ways to gain more power and control. Markham's murder was just as carefully planned as Emery's. Again, there was no room for mistake, no room for hesitation. Kimball took his time, using every advantage at his disposal to ensure that he could manipulate Markham into a situation where she would be powerless to escape. It was the classic play of a master manipulator: gain trust, exploit vulnerability, then execute the deadly final act. Casey McLeod's death was the final piece in the trio of victims that would serve as the foundation for Kimball's criminal legacy. McLeod, like Emery and Markham, had no idea she was walking into a trap. Her murder, too, followed the same disturbing blueprint that had been laid out before her. Kimball used his knowledge of her life, her weaknesses, and her aspirations to get close to her. By the time he pulled the trigger, figuratively and literally, McLeod was too far invested in their interaction to realize that she was being manipulated to her own death. It was an execution that bore the hallmarks of someone who had been doing this for far longer than anyone had realized. In each of these murders, Kimball displayed an eerie sense of control and manipulation. There was no sense of opportunity in his actions. These were not spur-of-the-moment killings born out of desperation or a lack of impulse control. Instead, they were orchestrated events, each carefully planned and executed to meet Kimball's specific needs. His victims were not random, they were selected, chosen based on their perceived value or vulnerability. Kimball understood that to continue his reign of terror, he needed to eliminate those who were most likely to uncover his secrets or challenge his control. What made Kimball so chilling was not just his ability to take lives, but his capacity to do so with such precision and planning. These were not crimes born of blind rage or careless mistakes. Each murder was a calculated part of a much larger scheme, a scheme that would continue for years and leave a wake of devastation in its path. His ability to maintain his composure and manipulate the situation to his advantage suggested a mind that was not just criminal, but also calculating and methodical. Kimball's ability to get away with these murders for as long as he did is a testament to how effective he was at hiding behind a mask of normalcy. He didn't stand out in a crowd, he wasn't someone people would immediately suspect of being a killer. And yet, behind closed doors, he was a master manipulator, capable of silencing anyone who threatened to reveal his true nature. His ability to manipulate his victims, as well as law enforcement, showcased his terrifying capacity for deception. At the same time, it's important to note that Kimball's actions were not driven purely by a desire to kill. The murders were just a means to an end, his true motivations were rooted in his need for power. In each of his interactions with his victims, he sought to control them, to own them, and to maintain a position of dominance. His violent acts were simply a manifestation of this deeper, more disturbing desire to assert his control over those around him. As his spree continued, the pattern of manipulation and murder would evolve, becoming even more intricate and insidious. Kimball's ability to maintain a facade of normalcy, while secretly orchestrating the destruction of those around him, would eventually lead him down a path of greater criminality and, eventually, his eventual downfall. But Kimball wasn't done. As his crimes escalated and his audacity grew, so did his ability to manipulate the systems that were designed to catch him. He wasn't just a master of personal deception, he knew how to play the game of cat and mouse with law enforcement. And as his body count grew, he found the perfect cover, a role that allowed him to get closer to the heart of the very agencies that sought to bring him down. Enter the FBI. Kimball's decision to become an informant was a stroke of cold-blooded genius. It was a maneuver born of both necessity and opportunity. As his violent spree progressed, he knew the net was tightening around him. Law enforcement was starting to catch on, and the whispers of his name were growing louder. Kimball realized that, in order to avoid being caught, he needed a new strategy. He would not be the hunted, he would become the hunter. By offering information to the FBI on other criminals, he could secure his immunity while keeping the authorities at bay, all the while continuing his dark path of destruction. The FBI, at the time, had no reason to be suspicious. Kimball presented himself as a reliable informant, someone who had deep knowledge of criminal organizations and networks. The fact that he had an inside track on various illicit operations made him highly valuable to the agency. In a world where informants were often key to cracking open cases and dismantling organized crime syndicates, Kimball seemed like a godsend. He had connections, knowledge, and, most importantly, the willingness to cooperate. For the FBI, this was the golden ticket they had been waiting for, an informant who could not only provide intel but also infiltrate criminal circles with ease. But what they didn't realize was that Kimball was a master manipulator, and he wasn't about to be outplayed. He wasn't just offering information in exchange for immunity, he was playing both sides of the field. Kimball's plan was simple, but incredibly dangerous. He would give the FBI just enough information to keep them on his side, all while covering his own tracks and continuing his murderous activities. At first, the information Kimball provided was highly valuable. He was able to provide the FBI with detailed intel on a range of criminal operations, from drug trafficking to organized crime syndicates, all of which seemed to have been very legitimate. His knowledge was expansive, and his connections were credible. The agency had no reason to doubt him. His insights were spot on, and his ability to get into places that law enforcement could never infiltrate made him an even more valuable asset. Kimball was quickly becoming a key player in the FBI's fight against organized crime. He was on the inside, and they thought they had a valuable ally. But as the weeks and months passed, Kimball began to shift the dynamic. He played the role of the informant to perfection, offering tidbits of useful information when it suited him. He was careful and calculated, knowing that the FBI needed him more than he needed them. The more the FBI relied on him, the more Kimball gained the upper hand. He kept his true intentions hidden, pretending to be an ally while continuing his own criminal activities. As the FBI began to trust him more, they allowed him deeper access into the world they were trying to take down. Kimball had a unique advantage over other informants, his criminal mind and deep understanding of how criminals think. He knew what law enforcement wanted to hear, what would impress them, and what would keep them coming back for more. The FBI, for their part, saw Kimball as a critical asset, a way to take down criminals on a larger scale than they could have ever hoped to accomplish on their own. But the truth was, they were unknowingly aiding and abetting a murderer. While they were working to dismantle criminal organizations, they were missing the bigger picture. Kimball himself was a criminal mastermind, operating under their noses. Kimball's manipulation of the FBI was subtle but effective. He didn't need to provide them with groundbreaking intel all the time, he simply gave them enough to keep them hooked. Small victories, little wins, and just enough progress to make the FBI believe that they were on the right path. He knew that the more successful they were in their investigations, the more they would trust him. And the more they trusted him, the more leeway they would give him to continue his covert activities. Kimball wasn't just avoiding capture, he was actively controlling the situation. He kept the FBI engaged by providing just enough to keep them interested, while he remained the puppet master, pulling the strings behind the scenes. At the same time, Kimball's double life allowed him to cover his tracks more effectively. He could commit crimes under the radar, knowing that he had an entire agency focused on other targets. The resources, manpower, and attention that the FBI devoted to him as an informant diverted their focus away from the very real danger he posed. The FBI believed they were using Kimball to help take down dangerous criminals, but in reality, he was using them to cover his tracks, bide his time, and continue his reign of terror. Kimball's ability to maintain his cover for so long was a testament to how well he understood human nature. He was a master of deception, constantly shifting his persona to fit whatever role was required. To the FBI, he was a valuable informant, but to those who knew the truth about him, he was a calculated predator, hiding in plain sight. Kimball had become so adept at playing the system that the very agency that was meant to stop him was unknowingly aiding him in his crimes. He had turned the tables entirely, exploiting the trust the FBI had placed in him to further his own sinister goals. Even as Kimball's relationship with the FBI deepened, his true nature remained hidden. He didn't let up on his killing spree. In fact, it seemed as though the more power he gained, the more he indulged his darkest impulses. His actions were no longer driven by desperation or necessity. Instead, they were the product of a man who had learned to use the system to his advantage, a man who understood how to manipulate people and institutions to serve his own needs. In the end, the relationship between Kimball and the FBI would prove to be a disastrous one. The agency, despite all its resources and intelligence, had failed to see the bigger picture. Kimball wasn't just another informant, they had unwittingly brought a killer into their ranks, a killer who would continue to thrive in the shadows of their investigations. Kimball's ability to manipulate the FBI was the epitome of his criminal genius. He had played them all along, and as his web of lies continued to grow, the truth became harder to uncover. The very agency designed to protect the public had been unwittingly aiding a murderer, allowing him to further his crimes. Kimball's manipulation was not just a tale of a man deceiving law enforcement, it was a lesson in the power of deception, the dangers of trusting the wrong person, and the chilling ability of a criminal mind to outsmart those who are supposed to be hunting it. What makes Kimball truly dangerous is not just his capacity for violence, but his extraordinary ability to deceive. He wasn't just a murderer, he was a manipulator, a master of psychological games who knew how to prey on the vulnerabilities of others. Kimball's charm, his ability to blend into society and project an image of normalcy, made him an even more insidious figure. Each of his victims, while seemingly separate individuals, were all part of the same twisted pattern, a pattern that Kimball meticulously constructed to suit his own dark needs. Kimball didn't kill simply for the sake of it. To him, each victim served a specific purpose, and every act of violence was carefully planned as part of a larger narrative he had created in his mind. He understood people better than most. He knew how to manipulate their emotions, how to play on their fears and insecurities, and how to make them trust him before ultimately betraying them. For Kimball, the art of deception wasn't just a means to an end, it was a way of life. He understood that true control lay not just in physical dominance, but in psychological manipulation. He preyed on the weaknesses of his victims, using their own emotions and trust as weapons to ensure their ultimate demise. Take, for example, the way he interacted with his victims before he killed them. Kimball wasn't an impulsive killer, he was a man who understood timing and psychology. Each victim was carefully chosen, not just for their connection to him, but because they had something he could use against them. Whether it was emotional manipulation, promises of protection, or simply making them feel safe and cared for, Kimball knew exactly how to get under their skin. This ability to get inside his victims' heads made him all the more dangerous. By the time they realized what he was capable of, it was already too late. He didn't just kill in cold blood. He controlled. He lied. He was a puppet master who knew how to make people dance to his tune. His victims were not simply murdered, they were manipulated, coerced, and ultimately disposed of when they no longer served a purpose in his grand scheme. Every interaction with them was part of his larger plan, each word he spoke, every promise he made, was just another calculated move in his deadly game. And, like any good manipulator, he knew how to keep his true intentions hidden behind a veneer of normalcy and charm. Kimball was also a master at playing different roles, depending on the situation. When interacting with law enforcement or other authorities, he was a chameleon. He had the ability to shift between being a concerned citizen, a helpful informant, and even a victim of circumstance, depending on what best served his interests. When he was around law enforcement, Kimball was always 2 steps ahead, knowing exactly what to say and how to act to keep suspicion at bay. He had an uncanny ability to read people, to understand what they wanted to hear, and to manipulate the conversation in his favor. This ability to deceive wasn't limited to his victims, it extended to everyone he encountered. Kimball knew how to push the right buttons, how to exploit people's emotions, and how to play on their weaknesses. His manipulation wasn't just a means to get away with murder, it was a way of life for him. He enjoyed having power over others, and that power extended to the very people who were tasked with catching him. By the time law enforcement began to catch on to his true nature, Kimball had already ingrained himself into the system in a way that made it nearly impossible for anyone to see through his facade. But it wasn't just the law enforcement officers he was deceiving. Kimball's victims, too, were caught in his web of lies. He didn't just take their lives, he took their trust, their safety, and their sense of security. His ability to make people feel safe around him was perhaps the most disturbing part of his actions. He didn't just take advantage of his victims' weaknesses, he actively cultivated their trust and made them believe that he was someone they could rely on. This trust was a key component of his deception, and it was what allowed him to lure people into dangerous situations without them ever realizing what was happening until it was too late. Each victim in Kimball's life left a mark, not just on him but on those around them. Kimball's victims weren't just numbers in a cold, calculated spree, they were real people, with families, friends, and dreams that were all brutally cut short. The emotional and psychological toll on the families and loved ones of his victims is incalculable. The grief, confusion, and anger that followed each death were the consequences of Kimball's actions, and they were felt far beyond the immediate circle of those directly involved. The lives he destroyed, both directly and indirectly, were far-reaching, leaving scars that would last a lifetime for those who survived. Jennifer Markham, Casey McLeod, and Leanne Emery weren't just victims, they were people who had dreams and aspirations, who had families and futures ahead of them. They had their own stories, their own struggles, their own lives that were stolen from them. And Kimball's ability to manipulate and deceive didn't just kill them physically, it killed their potential, their hopes, and their futures. The emotional toll on the families of these victims cannot be overstated. For them, the loss of a loved one is not just the end of a life, it's the end of a future, the destruction of an entire world that existed before the murder. The psychological scars left on families and friends by a killer like Kimball are lifelong, and they ripple through communities, leaving a wake of sadness, confusion, and sometimes even rage. The damage caused by Kimball's ability to deceive and manipulate went far beyond the murders themselves. Kimball's ability to deceive wasn't just about getting away with murder, it was about making sure no one ever truly understood the depths of his depravity. He made sure that the narrative surrounding his actions was always shaped by his own hand. Even when his victims were gone, Kimball's lies continued to control the story, manipulating not just those around him, but the very way in which the world saw him. He wasn't just a murderer, he was a man who knew how to hide in plain sight, how to make everyone believe that he was someone worthy of their trust, even when he was actively betraying them. The aftermath of Kimball's crimes was a haunting reminder of just how dangerous a person could be when they operated in the shadows, manipulating and deceiving those around them with precision and cunning. Once his true nature began to surface, the sheer magnitude of his manipulations became apparent. It was no longer a simple case of finding a murderer, it had evolved into an intense psychological investigation that sought to unravel the complexity of his mind and the web of lies he had woven around everyone he encountered. For months, Kimball had successfully hidden behind his false persona, playing the role of a helpful informant, a reliable ally to the authorities, and a man with a history of criminal knowledge. But his arrogance was his undoing. As investigators pieced together the puzzle of his crimes, they began to notice patterns that suggested he was not simply a criminal, but a puppet master, orchestrating everything from his relationships with victims to his interactions with law enforcement. Kimball's ability to deceive those around him didn't end when he was arrested. In custody, he continued his manipulative ways, shifting blame onto others and attempting to deflect responsibility for his actions. Even when he was confronted with the overwhelming evidence of his crimes, he refused to admit guilt. Instead, he clung to his narrative, telling anyone who would listen that he was merely a victim of circumstance, that his actions were somehow justified, or that others had forced his hand. It was a familiar tactic, one he had used countless times throughout his life, and it demonstrated just how deeply embedded his need for control and manipulation had become. Law enforcement officers and investigators quickly realized that Kimball was no ordinary criminal. He wasn't just a cold-blooded killer, he was a master of psychological manipulation. His ability to shift the focus of investigations, to cast doubt on his own involvement, and to exploit the weaknesses of those around him made him an incredibly difficult individual to deal with. His capacity for deception extended beyond his personal interactions. He used every tool at his disposal to maintain control over the narrative, even when his actions were being scrutinized by the very people who had arrested him. In the beginning, it seemed like the investigation was simply about identifying a killer and gathering enough evidence to prosecute him. But as the case progressed, it became clear that there was more to Kimball's crimes than anyone had initially realized. The investigation was no longer just about finding a murderer, it became about understanding the depth of his deception, how he had manipulated not only his victims but also the entire justice system. One of the most unsettling aspects of the investigation was the realization that Kimball had been playing a long game, far longer than anyone had anticipated. His ability to charm, deceive, and manipulate those around him, including law enforcement officers and even his victims, was a testament to his dangerous intelligence. He didn't just prey on weak individuals, he targeted people who, in his mind, were useful to his plan, and he took great care in ensuring that he maintained control over his interactions with them. Even after his arrest, he continued to play the system, shifting blame, casting doubt, and attempting to manipulate the emotions of those trying to bring him to justice. It became increasingly apparent that the investigation was about more than simply tracking down a criminal. It was about uncovering the full extent of his manipulations. Investigators found themselves peeling back layer after layer of deceit, each one revealing a more disturbing truth. Kimball had been hiding in plain sight for years, his crimes carefully concealed beneath a facade of cooperation and charm. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Kimball's criminal activities were far more expansive than anyone had initially suspected. His role as an informant had been nothing more than a carefully constructed cover for his darker, more dangerous ambitions. He had used his position to gather information, to manipulate people, and to deflect suspicion from his true nature. The psychological toll of the investigation was not just felt by the authorities, but by the families of Kimball's victims as well. For those who had lost loved ones to his manipulations, the long road to uncovering the truth was fraught with pain, frustration, and heartbreak. As investigators dug deeper into Kimball's past, they uncovered not just his connection to the murders, but also the intricate web of lies and deceit that had made him so difficult to catch. Each revelation seemed to confirm what had always been suspected, that Kimball was a man who thrived on chaos, who fed off the suffering of others, and who had no moral compass guiding his actions. The families of his victims were forced to endure the slow, painful process of learning the full extent of his crimes. They had to come to terms with the fact that their loved ones had been taken not just by a killer, but by someone who had manipulated them into trusting him. Each new detail of the investigation added to their grief, as they realized that their loved ones had been preyed upon in ways they had never imagined. But for those families, the truth was essential, and with every revelation, they were one step closer to understanding why their loved ones had been taken from them. For law enforcement, the investigation into Kimball's life and crimes became a test of their own ability to cope with a case unlike any they had ever encountered. Kimball's ability to deceive and manipulate was unprecedented, and it forced investigators to rethink their approach to criminal behavior. The case wasn't just about catching a murderer, it was about understanding a criminal mind that was as calculating and deceptive as it was dangerous. It was about piecing together the puzzle of his life, understanding how he had managed to play everyone around him for so long, and learning from his ability to manipulate even the most seasoned law enforcement officers. In the end, as Kimball's true nature was exposed, the damage he had caused was undeniable. His victims were real people, with lives that had been cruelly stolen away. Their families were left to pick up the pieces, to try to understand the magnitude of the loss they had endured. And the investigation continued, its scope widening with each new revelation. Kimball's legacy, built on a foundation of lies, deception, and murder, would never be forgotten. His ability to manipulate and deceive would forever be a part of his criminal legacy, and the investigation into his actions would continue to serve as a reminder of just how far a man like Kimball could go to hide his true self.